Before you allow your consciousness to drift into the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the deep, take a moment to settle into the stillness of your surroundings. Imagine the heavy, cool pressure of the ocean pressing against the glass of your mind, not as a burden, but as a protective cocoon. The world above is distant, a flickering memory of wind and sun that no longer concerns you. Here, in the heart of the Clockwork Tide, everything moves with a slow, deliberate precision. Listen to the imagined sound of giant brass gears turning in the dark, the hiss of steam through copper pipes, and the steady, hypnotic drip of oil onto cold steel. Your breath is the engine, your thoughts are the fading embers of a furnace. Let the weight of the water pull you down into a deep, dreamless rest as the story begins to unfold in the silence of the abyss. The Great Chronometer of Sector 9 did not merely tell time. It dictated the heartbeat of the entire submerged colony, its massive, interlocking gears carved from salvaged brass and obsidian, turning with a tectonic slowness that resonated through the basalt floors of the residential domes. Elias Thorne, the chief horologist of the gearworks, stood on a narrow catwalk suspended over the central assembly, his hands resting on a railing that thrummed with the low-frequency vibration of 1,000 synchronized escapements. The air here was thick with the scent of lubricating grease, ozone, and the faint, metallic tang of the mercury that pulsed through the cooling veins of the city's primary processors. It was a sensory environment that Elias had inhabited for 4 decades, a world defined by the predictable geometry of circles and the uncompromising logic of the pendulum. Yet, on this particular cycle, as the simulated dawn began to bleed a pale, artificial gold across the overhead LED arrays, Elias noticed a discrepancy that defied the laws of his craft. In the shadow cast by the primary drive wheel, a pool of liquid silver was moving against the incline of the housing, a shimmering, mercury-like substance that seemed to possess a localized gravity of its own. He descended the spiral staircase, his boots clicking rhythmically on the iron treads, each sound echoing in the cavernous space of the chronostatic chamber. The chamber was a marvel of Vernera ambition, a cathedral of industry where the walls were lined with thousands of smaller clocks, each representing a different subsystem of the colony's life support. There were clocks for the oxygen scrubbers, clocks for the nutrient recyclers, and clocks for the simulated tides that moved the water within the internal canals to prevent stagnation. Everything was connected, a vast, mechanical web of dependencies that ensured the survival of the 6,000 souls living beneath the Atlantic shelf. Elias reached the base of the drive wheel and knelt, his lantern casting a flickering light over the pool of silver. It wasn't mercury, at least not any isotope he was familiar with. It was denser, more reflective, and as he watched, it began to shape itself into a jagged, geometric shadow that mirrored his own movements with a terrifying, lagless precision. This was the first hint of the Dickean rot that had begun to seep into the gearworks, the suspicion that the physical world was no longer adhering to its programmed parameters. Elias reached out a gloved finger to touch the substance, but it retreated, sliding into the microscopic gaps between the gears with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence. He felt a sudden, sharp prick of vertigo, a sensation that the floor beneath him was not solid rock, but a thin, translucent membrane stretched over a void. He looked up at the Great Chronometer, and for a moment, the brass faces of the dials seemed to liquefy, the Roman numerals blurring into a chaotic stream of binary code before snapping back into their rigid, Victorian shapes. He rubbed his eyes, the smell of ozone intensifying until it tasted like copper on his tongue. Was he experiencing a sensory malfunction, a breakdown of his own neural implants, or was the Clockwork Tide itself beginning to stutter? He sought out Kaya, the senior systems analyst who lived in the pressurized reaches of the archive domes. Kaya was a woman whose mind was a labyrinth of data shards and forgotten histories, a person who saw the world not in terms of gears and steam, but as a series of nested simulations. She met him in a small, circular room filled with the hum of vacuum tubes and the soft glow of holographic terminals. Elias described the Mercury Shadow, the way it moved, and the brief, terrifying dissolution of the chronometer's face. Kaya did not look surprised. Instead, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a series of parchment maps, their edges scorched and brittle. She showed him a set of architectural plans for a Sector 0, a level of the city that didn't exist in any modern directory. It was a place where the mechanical and the digital were supposed to merge, a central processing hub that predated the Great Submergence. According to Kaya, the city was not just a lifeboat. It was a recursive loop, a machine designed to archive the human experience by replaying it over and over in a controlled environment. The Clockwork Tide was the mechanism of this repetition, a physical manifestation of a data refresh that occurred every 72 years. The Mercury Shadow Elias had seen was a leak, a fragment of the previous cycle that hadn't been properly erased. It was a memory of a world that had already happened, manifesting as a physical anomaly in the current iteration of the gearworks. As they spoke, the lights in the archive dome flickered, the pale gold of the artificial sun replaced for a fraction of a second by a blinding, ultraviolet glare that revealed the skeletal structure of the dome's supports. For that heartbeat, Elias didn't see a city of brass and stone. He saw a vast, crystalline lattice suspended in a vacuum, a cold, indifferent architecture of pure information. The journey to find the source of the leak took Elias and Kaya deep into the foundations of the colony, past the abandoned mining shafts and the rusted hulls of the first-generation pressure spheres. The environment changed as they descended, the Victorian elegance of the upper levels giving way to a more primitive, functional aesthetic. The walls were no longer basalt, but a matte black composite that felt warm to the touch and pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heat. This was the skin of the machine, the interface between the dream of the Lhasa Prime and the reality of the abyss. They found themselves in a corridor where the water was no longer held back by glass, but by a shimmering field of static. Through the static, Elias could see the ocean, but it wasn't the dark, pressurized Atlantic he expected. It was a sea of mercury, a silver expanse that stretched away into an infinite horizon, illuminated by a sun that was a giant, ticking clock. In the center of this surreal landscape stood the Mercury Shadow, no longer a small pool of liquid, but a towering silhouette of a man made of gears and light. The figure spoke, its voice a symphony of clicking metal and white noise. It told Elias that it was the governor of the tide, the entity responsible for ensuring that the simulation remained stable. But the machine was failing. The hardware was decaying, and the mercury was the byproduct of the system's attempts to patch the holes in reality. The Shadow explained that Elias himself was not the original chief horologist, but the 47th version of a man who had died centuries ago. Every movement he made, every thought he had, was a script written by a dying mainframe attempting to preserve a version of humanity that no longer existed in the world above. Elias felt a profound sense of grief, not for himself, but for the beauty of the clockwork world he had spent his life maintaining. He looked at his hands, expecting to see brass and wires, but they still looked like flesh and bone, scarred by years of labor and stained with oil. The shadow offered him a choice. He could trigger a full system reset, which would erase the Mercury Shadow and restore the simulation to its pristine, golden state, or he could allow the tide to break, revealing the true nature of their existence to the 6,000 people living in the domes. To reset meant to choose a comfortable lie, a perpetual cycle of gears and simulated suns. To break meant to face the void, to wake up to a reality that might be nothing more than cold basalt and empty air. As he stood at the edge of the static field, watching the silver sea and the ticking sun, Elias thought of the children in the residential domes, the families waking up to their recycled oxygen, and the quiet, rhythmic peace of the life they knew. He thought of the blue pixel Silas Vance had once seen, and the way the shadows in the city had always been just a second too slow. He realized that the truth was not a destination, but a burden that few were prepared to carry. He looked at Kaya, whose eyes were filled with the reflected light of the Mercury Sea. She didn't tell him what to do, she simply waited, a witness to the final gears of their history. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his master key, a heavy, brass instrument that could stop the heart of the Great Chronometer. He held it over the primary drive gears of the interface, his hand trembling. The air in the chamber grew cold, the smell of ozone replaced by the scent of ancient, dusty parchment. The Mercury Shadow began to merge with the gears, the silver liquid coating the brass until the entire room was a shimmering, reflective cage. Elias saw his own reflection in 1,000 different surfaces, 1,000 versions of himself standing in the same spot, making the same choice. He saw the city as it was, and as it could be, a masterpiece of human ingenuity and a tragic monument to human denial. He closed his eyes, listening to the Clockwork Tide one last time, the steady, hypnotic beat of a world that refused to die. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the key, not to reset the system, but to lock it in place. He chose to freeze the moment, to live in the stutter, to inhabit the space between the lie and the truth where the Mercury shadows moved with a life of their own. The city of Thalassa Prime did not collapse, but it changed. The simulated sun remained in a perpetual state of twilight, the pale gold light infused with a subtle, silver shimmer. The clocks in the gearworks no longer ticked in unison. They followed their own individual rhythms, a chaotic but beautiful orchestra of time. The people noticed the difference, but they didn't panic. They found a new kind of peace in the unpredictability, a sense of wonder in the glitches. They began to see the Mercury shadows as guardians, as fragments of a memory they were all slowly beginning to share. Elias Thorne remained at his post, no longer a servant of the machine, but a curator of the anomaly. He spent his days watching the silver liquid move through the gears, a reminder that even in a world made of code and clockwork, there was still room for the ghost in the machine. And as the tides of the synthetic abyss continued to wash over the domes, the citizens of the deep slept, their dreams filled with the sound of a ticking sun and the sight of a sea that was made of starlight. The narrative of the Clockwork Tide is one of endurance and the refusal to be erased. In the silence of the gearworks, the sound of the gears is a lullaby, a rhythmic assurance that as long as the wheels turn, the memory of the world above will never truly fade. The pressure of the ocean is a comforting weight, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the small, precious light of the city. Here, in the heart of the Mercury Shadow, time is not a line, but a circle, a beautiful, repeating pattern that holds the essence of what it means to be human. And as the story of Elias and the Silver Sea drifts into the quiet corners of your mind, let your breathing stay slow and steady, mirroring the heartbeat of the deep. You are safe in the vault, protected by the glass and the gears, as the Clockwork Tide carries you into a deep, peaceful sleep, where the shadows are made of mercury and the dawn is always just a heartbeat away. The textures of this world are carved from the very substance of patience. Every valve in the city of Thalassoprime, every hand-cranked regulator in the lower depths, represents a minute of human attention, a deliberate act of care in an environment that is naturally hostile to life. To understand the Mercury Shadow, one must first understand the weight of that care. Elias Thorne had spent decades polishing the same brass housings, feeling the slight heat of the friction under his palms, and listening for the minute discordant clicks that signaled a misalignment in the city's temporal spine. He knew the personality of every engine, the way Sector 4's turbines would groan during the third watch, and the way the cooling fans in the archive domes would whisper like a crowd in a distant room. This intimacy with the mechanical was his only defense against the growing unreality of his world. When the silver liquid first appeared, it wasn't just a physical anomaly, it was a personal betrayal, a flaw in the one thing he trusted implicitly, the machine. As he walked the corridors in the days following his encounter with the governor of the Tide, Elias began to see the city with new eyes. He noticed that the velvet curtains in the grand theaters were slightly translucent if you caught them at the right angle, revealing a flickering grid of light underneath. He saw that the dust on the windows of the observation decks was actually a fine layer of digital noise, a static that clung to the edges of their perception. These were the Dickian moments, the sudden, jarring realizations that the environment was an illusion, a curated sensory experience designed to prevent the mind from collapsing under the reality of its own isolation. But rather than being terrified, Elias felt a strange, detached curiosity. If the world was a simulation, then the Mercury Shadow was the most honest thing in it, a raw, unpolished fragment of the processing power that sustained them. He and Kaya began a series of clandestine experiments, using the limited tools at their disposal to map the leaks. They found that certain words, when spoken in specific resonance chambers, would cause the walls to momentarily lose their opacity. They discovered that by altering the rhythm of the tide pumps, they could change the weather in the hydroponic domes, shifting it from a perpetual, humid afternoon to a crisp, autumnal chill that hadn't been felt in the city for generations. They were hacking the dream, not to destroy it, but to see how much it could bend before it broke. Kaya, ever the philosopher of the data shards, argued that they were performing a sacred duty. "We are not just inhabitants," she would say, her voice muffled by the hum of the vacuum tubes. "We are the auditors of the afterlife. We are ensuring that the story we are living is still worth telling." But the governor of the Tide was not the only entity watching them. The Board of Atmospheric Stability, the bureaucratic shadow government that managed the day-to-day operations of the city, had begun to take notice of the irregularities. They were men and women of a different breed, descendants of the founders who believed that the illusion was the only thing that mattered. For them, any crack in the simulation was a threat to social order, a potential catalyst for a mass awakening that they were ill-equipped to handle. They saw Elias's fascination with the mercury liquid as a form of mechanical heresy, a dangerous obsession that could destabilize the city's psychological foundation. They sent their enforcers, silent, gray-clad men whose faces were perpetually hidden behind brass-filtered respirators, to monitor the gearworks, their presence a cold, intrusive weight in the warm, oily air of the chambers. The tension between the two factions, those who sought the truth of the shadow and those who clung to the safety of the clockwork, mirrored the internal conflict within Elias himself. Part of him wanted to return to the simple, predictable life of a horologist, to spend his remaining years in the amber glow of the bioreactors, pretending that the sky was real. But another part of him, the part that had touched the silver liquid and seen the ticking sun, could no longer be satisfied with a beautiful lie. He felt like a character in a Jules Verne novel who had suddenly realized he was being read, a man whose adventures were dictated by the ink and paper of a higher reality. He was trapped between the mechanical certainty of the 19th century and the existential dread of the 21st, a pioneer of the abyss whose greatest discovery was the fragility of his own soul. In the final cycles of the story, as the Mercury Shadow began to permeate the very air of the city, the boundary between the dream and the reality became almost non-existent. People reported seeing loved ones who had been dead for decades walking through the corridors of the residential domes, their forms shimmering with a silver light. The simulated tides began to bring in surface artifacts that shouldn't have been there, some bleached shells, pieces of driftwood, and old, salt-crusted coins that felt like they belonged to a world that had never known the pressure of the deep. The city was merging with its own history, a recursive loop that was finally closing in on itself. And in the center of it all stood Elias Thorne, his hand still resting on the master key of the Great Chronometer, a sentinel at the edge of time. The end of the story is not a conclusion, but a transition. As the Clockwork Tide carries the city into its new, shimmering state, the sound of the gears becomes a melody, a song of remembrance and hope. The Mercury Shadow is no longer a threat, but a bridge, a way for the people of Thalassoprime to connect with the truth of their existence without being destroyed by it. They are the inhabitants of the synthetic abyss, the guardians of the last flame of humanity, and they have found a way to live in the space between the gears. And as you, the listener, drift further into the quiet, dark waters of sleep, remember that the truth is whatever gives you the strength to keep dreaming. The deep is a place of peace, the city is a place of wonder, and the shadows are just another way of seeing the light. Sleep now, in the heart of the clockwork, as the silver sea carries you home.